Hello, everyone. I have a guest today I'd like to introduce you to, Sam. He'll tell us a little bit about himself, how he came to the non-Trinitarian view, and what type of background church he grew up in.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. It's always fun to talk to you.
Let's start, Sam, with your growing up. You grew up in a church, I suppose. What type of church, what type of Christianity denomination, and so on?
So, my parents had been part of the Way International, and my dad had joined in the early 70s. He went through the Way Corps, and my mom joined around the time that she met my dad. She found out about it through my dad. And they got married and had me, although even before I was born, Dr. Victor Werewolf, the leader of the Way, had passed away, and there was something of a secession crisis, and lots of groups splintered off and left during the process of that. So I basically grew up in a church that was sort of reorganized by a bunch of former Way people to create a new fellowship together. And so it was a pretty small congregation, like 50 to 100 people, but it was very tight knit, because everyone had sort of a similar background. And the Way International wasn't really a church, right? It was sort of like this weird in between, where it was like a teaching organization, but yet the people didn't really go to church and didn't entirely encourage people to go to church. It was kind of strange that way. So trying to build a church community out of that, it took a lot of figuring out what was good about what they had learned in the Way and what was bad, and how to kind of bring it together into a new congregation, really, that would be something that you could take your family to, and all of those sorts of things. So the church I grew up in was that we were a denomination of one, I guess. We didn't belong to a denomination. There were other churches like us, right? We weren't the only group of people that had tried to form a church out of sort of the collapse of the Way. There were a lot of groups that did that, and we were in loose contact with some of them, but not really close contact as far as I was ever aware. So we were mostly our own thing. And so we grew up, so I grew up not being Trinitarian. I grew up believing in biblical Unitarianism. We didn't call it that. We didn't have a name for what our not Trinitarianism was. We just knew that we didn't believe in the Trinity. I actually didn't know even the phrase biblical Unitarian until a couple years ago. I was like, oh yeah, well, yes, I'm a that, I guess.
So, Sam, just for the sake of our audience, tell us a little bit about the Way International. Not many people have heard of it. What other teachings or practices distinguish the Way International?
Sure. So the Way International was mainly a teaching organization that was founded around Dr. Victor Werewolf. And Dr. Werewolf, although even his PhD that earns him the name doctor, there's some fishiness that it might have been fraudulent. But I'll call him Dr. Werewolf anyway. Sort of in the 50s and 60s, he had come to, I think he had been trained as like a congregational minister and gone to Princeton Seminary or something like that. So he had been sort of just a normal mainstream Protestant. And then I think he had a series of, maybe you would say, spiritual experiences and encounters and connections that sort of shook him out of his preconceptions. And so he was just like, I'm going to go back to the Bible and try and figure out what this really teaches instead of just trusting tradition. And so he came up with non-Trinitarianism, basically biblical Unitarianism. Jesus is a man, God is just the Father, etc. He also taught annihilationism, that is, that the damned or the non-Christians don't go to an eternal hell. They are destroyed basically at the judgment, as opposed to living forever in hell. And that that humans don't go to heaven straight when you die, that they are asleep and unconscious and soul sleep until the resurrection, and that's when everyone gets sorted, and those who get eternal life live eternally in resurrected bodies, as opposed to living in sort of some spiritual heaven, something like that. And so there's a big emphasis on the kingdom of God in that sense, as opposed to just going to heaven when you die as sort of the thing to look forward to. They were very dispensationalist, right? Dispensation is sort of a method for interpreting scripture and figuring out what certain prophecies apply to whom, and sort of breaking up the Bible into different dispensations, I guess, as a way to sort of have a larger interpretive framework of all of it. So that was a big part of it. They also firmly believed in the gifts of the Spirit, right? So there was speaking in tongues and interpretation of tongues and prophecy. Healing was talked about and emphasized, but not to an extreme degree like some churches that I've heard of. And this somehow appealed to a bunch of mostly baby boomers. Like, I think that Dr. Werlow had been relatively obscure for a couple decades, and then somehow he made some connections, I think, especially in San Francisco, especially with like baby boomer hippies in the mid 60s. And it sort of kind of exploded from there. And pretty soon there was way international study groups on almost like every college campus. And there was, young people, a lot of whom were sort of hippies that were spiritual seekers, and then kind of found answers for what they were looking for in the Way International. And it attracted hundreds of thousands of people, I think, overall. And my dad was very much one of those people. He grew up in sort of a vaguely Christian background and had sort of a seeking and doubting phase in his teenage years, and listened to the Beatles and Bob Dylan and all that sort of, hippie 60 baby boomer stuff. And then in college came to find the Way International, and it was a transformative experience for him. So my dad was sort of typical in that way. And then it persisted for a couple decades, but it got increasingly cult-like, I would say, even to the point at the end where I think you would just pretty much call it a cult, where Dr. Werewolf was very much in charge. It was sort of a cult of personality around him. There was questions about finances and what he did with all the money, questions of sexual impropriety and abuse and stuff like that. And so it got, like, people who are in the Way often describe the early days as something like the closest they've experienced of heaven on earth. But by the time of like the mid 80s, things were starting to get less heavenly. And so when he died, that's sort of when it fell apart. I mean, the Way International technically exists, but at its peak, it was hundreds of thousands of people. Now I think it's hundreds of people. So that's a big difference. So that's sort of the background of the Way International. So it was a weird, unique thing, right? It grew very quickly and then fell apart almost as quickly. And it had a very unique combination of doctrines.
Now, do you still hold to those other Way International beliefs like dispensationalism? I believe they also teach once saved, always saved, Holy Spirit baptism over water, and so on. Do you still hold to any of that?
So I would say that I don't hold to dispensationalism anymore. I think that there's some serious problems with it. I wouldn't exactly be able to articulate what my clear alternative is, but I think there are problems with dispensationalism. I think perhaps the biggest problem of dispensationalism is that it can have a weird effect of underemphasizing what Jesus actually taught. And that seems to me to be perhaps its biggest mistake. And so I think that dispensationalism, especially extreme dispensationalism, can say that really the only thing that's relevant for the churches is the stuff that came after Pentecost, which is the revelations that Paul and the other epistle writers would have sent. Whereas Jesus being before Pentecost was actually a different dispensation, so that his teachings were mostly to his Jewish audience at the time and aren't as particularly relevant to us now. And I think that's a huge mistake. And so that is something that I've moved beyond. But I would say the annihilationism thing, I think that was right. The non-Trinitarianism, I think that was right. And so it's a weird mixed bag when you have to sort through things like that. So I would say, some of it's right, some of it was wrong. I grew up and my core identity was in this former Way congregation that held most of what it had learned, but was starting to slowly kind of filter through and get rid of some of the other things that it had learned. But I also, because my congregation was small, I went to youth group and summer camp and those sorts of things in regular mainstream Trinitarian evangelical churches. So like starting in like middle school or something like that, I would go and, go to youth group night or whatever, or, a worship night for teenagers or whatever, at Willow Creek Church in Chicago. I grew up in the Chicago suburbs, and Willow Creek is sort of like the super mainstream, typical evangelical mega church. I went to summer camp through Wheaton College and stuff like that. And I think that's important because I had like this sort of double exposure, right? I was exposed to both non-Trinitarianism, but I also had a lot of exposure to just sort of normal American evangelical Trinitarianism. And my parents taught me to keep silent, basically, on the topic of the Trinity. Like if it comes up, don't say anything and wait for the subject to change, because if you say anything, you're going to get in trouble. And so kind of part of that was like, my parents were like, there's good things for you to do. There's things for you to learn. Those are positive experiences. We want you to go to youth group. We want you to go to Christian summer camp. On the whole, it's a good thing, but, they have some slightly different beliefs from us. So just, don't make a big deal of it. So that was sort of my upbringing up through high school. So then I went to college at Cornell University in upstate New York. I studied statistics and economics. And so while I was there, I joined a Christian fellowship, one of the mainstream evangelical Christian fellowships that has, college ministries at various colleges all over the country. And I became a worship leader. I played guitar and sang in the worship band. And I became a Bible study leader. And I was also a member of the student leadership board. So I was very well connected and, participated very actively in the Christian fellowship. It was one of my favorite things in college. Most of my friends were in that fellowship. It was sort of one of my favorite things to do. So my sophomore year of college, so when I was 19 or 20, a leader in one of the other campus fellowships, not my personal campus fellowship, but one of the similar ones next to us. The leader, I think he was the president, he came out as gay and he took a boyfriend and he wanted his fellowship to affirm that relationship. And his fellowship was connected to a denomination that had clear policies on that. And so he was forced to step down from leadership and not be a leader, not be the president and not be the leader of a Bible study, but he was still allowed to attend. And then he ended up leaving, and that it was sort of quiet for a while. And then all of a sudden, I'm not quite sure how, but the LGBT organizations on campus found out about it and made a big protest of it. And so there was some protests, like hundreds or maybe even like 1,000 students protesting this Christian fellowship on campus. There was angry letters in the, student newspaper. And there was movement in the student government to try and have this group kicked off campus for basically having been discriminatory against this person. So it was a big kind of political firestorm, right? And this was 2008, 2009. So either Bush or Obama was president. And, this was right when this was still a big cultural flashpoint. And so it was sort of like there was a culture war on campus. And it was scary for the other Christian fellowships because they were worried that they might get kicked off campus too, or that there would be some rule passed where all of the Christian fellowships had to either say affirm LGBT, leaders or lose their funding, right? And there was worry that this was going to happen. And like, what's the balance between non-discrimination and religious freedom? And how does that apply on a college campus? All those sorts of questions were swirling around, right? So at first that, didn't really affect me. But then what happened is my campus fellowship decided that, oh, we need to have all of our leaders sign a statement of faith so that we can prevent this sort of situation ahead of time and make sure that all the leaders of our fellowship are, on board with their beliefs, right? And so they were kind of doing that to protect themselves legally because of what was happening around this LGBT question. And then, so then what happens is I get a statement of faith put in front of me from this fellowship, and they aren't doing it to try and get me in trouble. They're doing it to protect themselves, basically. But on this statement of faith, 2 or 3 of the bullet points or whatever have Trinitarian, theology in them. And so my campus fellowship was led by a minister, right? Basically a campus fellowship leader, a full-time staff person. And so I met with him to be like, look, I don't agree with all the bullet points on this statement of faith. I can't sign that. Is that a problem? What does that mean? And he was caught off guard. Like, oh, you don't believe in the Trinity? What? Like, I had been something of a leader in the Christian fellowship, and he assumed that I was, completely, theologically on board with what everyone else thought. So he was caught off guard. And so what ended up happening is I had to step down from leadership. I was no longer the worship leader. My Bible study kept meeting, but we were quietly unrecognized by the fellowship such that we weren't actually officially a Bible study. And I wasn't a student leader anymore. And at first this was kept quiet from all the other people in the fellowship. No one knew why I wasn't on the student leadership board anymore. They assumed I had resigned because I was too busy or something. And so it was kind of really hard and weird to keep that a secret, but yet I was like still around. It was a very strange situation. And so I ended up like the year afterwards, I like went up to the leader and was like, look, I can't deal with this anymore. I don't know if I'm in or out. I don't know what I'm allowed to do or not do. Can we reevaluate this? And he said, here's what I'll do. I'll put it up to a vote for the other student board leaders where they can vote on you. And the student board is composed of basically my friends, right? I know all of them very, very personally. One of them is even my roommate. And so they voted unanimously to keep me removed from leadership. And so that was a really hard blow, to basically be told by a bunch of my friends and a bunch of people I respected that my faith was out of bounds or something like that, or unfit for leadership, when I had already been serving with them without any issue for years. And it was also weird because I didn't do anything wrong, right? It's not like it's not like I had some behavioral issue or something like that. Like I hadn't changed, right? They put a statement of faith in front of me and I answered it honestly. And then all of a sudden I wasn't allowed to lead anymore, and I hadn't done anything wrong. So that was a strange and difficult situation. And it really kind of forced me to think about this issue for the first time, right? Like I had learned, a decent amount about what Bible verses, the reasons why we don't believe in the Trinity, et cetera, but I had never really made that theological question my own focus very much before. So I studied it a lot and started reading a bunch of books and church fathers and stuff like that. And the more that I read about it, the more I looked into it, the more I was like, I just really don't think this is true. I think what I was taught growing up made a lot more sense. I think that was right. And so I was willing to pay whatever price came for not being able to affirm that theological statement, as opposed to lie or pretend I didn't believe what I believed.
So if that had not happened in your life, I guess we wouldn't be here talking to each other. You would still try to get along in your church and so on, or?
That's a good question. If I would have become so theologically focused in my own sort of personal life and study, if that had never happened. I've never asked that question before, but it's probably true. I think if that hadn't have happened, I would have just continued coasting. Maybe something would have happened later, but maybe not. Yeah, I don't know.
We often, as non-Trinitarians, wonder, because sometimes, when Trinitarians become non-Trinitarians, I often wonder how many are like you in churches, Baptist, Presbyterian, whatever Trinitarian denomination. How prevalent do you think that is? How many Sams are there, do you think, in those pews or in those fellowships?
I think that there's probably quite a bit. I think that lots of people know that, there are some areas where you can ask theological questions, and that's fine and that's allowed. But this topic is off limits, and that gets communicated, and people pick up on that. And I think, like, there was that Pew survey that came out very recently that asked a bunch of Americans, what they believe. And there was some questions that had, or no, it wasn't a Pew, it was a Legionnaire survey from Legionnaire Ministries. And they asked, a bunch of questions to a bunch of Americans what they believe about religion. And so you can see, one of the questions was, do you believe Jesus is God? And one of the questions, do you believe Jesus was created by God, or something like that? So you can filter down to like evangelical Christians who attend church every Sunday, right, in the survey results, and you can see what percent answered those questions. And a shockingly high percentage of them don't believe Jesus is God. Even if you say, I'm an evangelical who attends church every week, it was like 20 or 30%. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that they're biblical Unitarians. I suppose there could be other alternatives. But I think that there's actually a surprisingly large, I don't know, maybe 10% of people sitting in the pews who would otherwise call themselves Christians and who believe in the Bible secretly hold doubts about the Trinity. Maybe they don't have words for their doubts, right? They wouldn't know the phrase biblical Unitarianism or something like that, but they probably hear the Trinitarian stuff and like, I don't think that makes sense. When I read my Bible, it just seems to me more like there's God and then there's this son of his named Jesus, right? And they don't have words for it. So I think that actually is a pretty common widespread phenomenon. And I think that the true numbers would shock even us biblical Unitarians if people were to answer honestly.
Like our good friend Dr. Del Taggi says, they're probably confused Trinitarians. Yeah. You mentioned that, so your personal experience led you where we are now and into creating, if I may share your channel here. This is Sam's channel, and he's done some very interesting interviews with various philosophers slash theologians. So this intensified your study of this topic of the doctrine of the Trinity. What have you learned that you did not learn before?
I think I'll tell another story that will lead up even before. It took me getting kicked in the butt one more time on this subject before I made this YouTube channel. So after I graduated from college, I sort of left that whole drama with my Christian fellowship behind. And I started attending just a regular evangelical Trinitarian church. I moved to a new city, not where I'd grown up. And so I just went to the normal local church that was kind of like Willow Creek, basically. And, I attended church almost every Sunday, and I volunteered in the youth group and, did some of those normal sort of things. And it was fine. Never came up, Some of the sermons, if they were about Trinitarian stuff, I would kind of wince and roll my eyes, but most of the time it really doesn't come up, and it's perfectly fine. So I had a perfectly positive experience for years. I got married. I went to grad school. I went to Harvard University and I studied biostatistics there. And then after I get my master's degree from Harvard, I moved back to the Chicago area, back where I grew up. And so the church that I'd grown up with had basically no longer existed anymore. It had been shrinking in numbers over the years. And by the time I came back, after I'd been gone for like 11 years from the Chicago area, it basically wasn't there anymore in the way that I had grown up knowing it. And my wife and I went to, a regular evangelical Bible church in the Chicago area. And we had been going there for about a year and everything was fine. We were in a Bible study, things were going well. And the pastor asked for volunteers from the worship band. And so I was like, oh, I play guitar, I can sing. Or, well, some people would argue that I can't sing, but I can certainly play guitar. And so I volunteered for the worship band, and that led to a series of things, which I'm sure you and a lot of your listeners are familiar with, where I could see that in between me and playing guitar was going to be a statement of faith signing event again. So I just like circumvented it. I went like straight to the pastor and was like, all right, but before I cause any attention or, anything like that, let's just talk about this. And so I met with him and an elder, and I told them, the story that I just told you more or less. And they were like, what? Doesn't believe in the Trinity, but you believe in the Bible? And they were just completely flabbergasted. They didn't know how to classify it. So they had to go meet, and they met with the elder board to decide what to do with me. And so, a month or two later, I meet with the pastor again, and we're having some sort of friendly banter. And then he asked me, so Sam, have you been taking communion at the church? And I was like, oh no. Oh, I know what he's going to say next. I said, well, yes, I have been taking communion. He's like, well, we're going to have to ask you to stop taking communion for now. And I was completely floored, because like he was trying to be nice, but what he was actually doing was excommunicating me in the very literal sense of the word. And I was like, this just seems unnecessarily harsh. I haven't done anything wrong. What's the problem? Et cetera, et cetera. And he didn't really have honestly good answers to a lot of the questions that I threw back at him. So an interesting thing, some of your listeners might enjoy this detail. Fred Sanders, who is something like the evangelical expert on the Trinity. There's a good debate between Fred Sanders and Anthony Buzzard from back in the day. And so Fred Sanders, writes books on the Trinity. He's sort of like the traveling evangelical Trinity expert. He was in Chicago for that semester. He was doing some sort of, I don't know, where you visit another seminary or they're a visiting fellowship or something like that. So he was in the Chicago area at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. And so, he had been roommates with my pastor at that time in seminary. And so they knew each other. So he's like, look, I'll have you meet with Fred Sanders. He'll answer all your questions, basically. And I also think that he was thinking that Fred Sanders will back me up on this one and back me up on my decision. He's the expert. So I had an hour-long meeting with Fred Sanders and my pastor. And I had read a couple of Fred Sanders's books in preparation for this meeting. I had listened to him on YouTube and listened to that Anthony Buzzard debate too. And I was really wanting to focus our conversation on the question, why do you need to believe in the Trinity in order to be saved or in order to take communion? Like, trying to debate the whole Trinity is too big of a question, right? And, good luck me changing Fred Sanders' mind on that. But if I could focus the question on why would this be an excommunicable offense, right? Not everyone who takes communion in the church signs the statement of faith. Not everyone who takes communion agrees with all of the tenets, right? To become a member, you have to sign the statement of faith. And that makes sense to some degree, I suppose. But to take communion, they don't ask you anything other than if you believe in Jesus, right? And they leave it up to you to determine if you can take communion or not. And so that was my question. Why do you have to believe in the Trinity in order to receive communion? And the conversation didn't really stay focused very well. And it really kind of turned into something of a debate between me and Fred Sanders. And what was strange is I didn't feel like he had good answers for my questions. I was like, so this is the expert, this is like the guy, and he can't even answer what I feel like are some pretty basic questions. And when he asks me questions or when he comes at me, I can give good responses, right? If this is the best that there is, and I'm just some random guy who, studies statistics, so that was an enlightening experience. And after that, I was like, man, I really need to make sure that I'm not just being stubborn and stupid about this. And so I decided to create my YouTube channel for a couple reasons. One, it gave me an excuse to invite smart and learned people to talk to me, right? Because finding people who know a lot about the Trinity but are willing to talk about it is kind of hard in everyday life. And so it gave me a way to have access to those people. And I also wanted to help encourage people who were like me to help, give them resources or to help them understand these topics too. And maybe some other people would enjoy it. And, there are a lot of debates and arguments on YouTube, but there aren't a lot of what I would call kind of casual but engaging conversations on the topic of the Trinity. And so I wanted to have a YouTube channel where the temperature in the room was a little bit lower than it is in a debate, but the substance was still engaging. And so that's my YouTube channel, and I have a mix of sort of experts and some of my friends and stuff like that that I've talked with on my YouTube channel.
So to this day, Sam, I ask myself, why such a strong, sometimes violent reaction towards other self-professed Christians? I mean, you talked about history earlier on, and if you go back in history, it was awful, right? We had inquisitions, we had burnings. The famous story for our audience of Michael Servetus, please read up on that. I mean, Jesus did command us, Christians, to love our enemies, but they're not even interested in discipleship. Why do you think that is? What is your take on that type of Christianity?
It's an excellent question. And I think it's a very deep question, because I think that the answer, so I find the Arian controversy, right, the theological, dispute that happened in the early 4th century to be a very interesting thing. Obviously, it's, anyone who's interested in the topic of the Trinity should know a lot about the Arian controversy, but it's also just a historically fascinating period, right? There's the Roman Empire, there's Constantine, there's wars, there's all sorts of cool dramas. So even if you find theology kind of dry, if you like history and politics and war and all those sorts of things, it's a very interesting time period. So what I think happened was, in sort of the mainstream church up until the 3rd century, there was a variety of opinions on how Jesus related to God that were acceptable in sort of the mainstream church. Outside of the mainstream church, you had the Gnostics, but they were outside the mainstream, and they had been outside the mainstream for a long time. And then there was like Jewish Christians, right, who still observed the law and that sort of thing, and still held an ethnic identity of being Jewish and were Christian, and they were sort of outside the mainstream. But inside the mainstream of what would become eventually the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church, but before it called itself that, there was a pretty big spectrum of opinion. And there would have ranged people who were like us, who were basically biblical Unitarians, who thought that Jesus was a man who had, who was a special revelation of, what it of God's Son, but not, some pre-existent being who had come into, creation. And then there was people who thought that Jesus was some sort of secondary deity, right, who had pre-existed but wasn't God himself. And there was people who thought that he was a kind of a co-equal deity with God the Father. And then there was even some kind of modalist sort of people like Marcellus of Ancyra who thought that basically somehow Jesus and God the Father were kind of part of the same person, more or less, sort of like oneness Pentecostals, or almost, you might say. And so there was a wide spectrum of agreement. And sometimes, there would be local councils that would rule against somebody, but all of these questions had never been formally answered before. And so you could be a Christian and be anywhere on that spectrum, as far as I could tell, before about 300 AD, and probably be, acceptable in your church, and maybe even become, a presbyter or a deacon or a bishop or whatever. Right? There are bishops even after the Council of Nicaea, who hold the same theology we do. That people don't know that, but there were biblical Unitarian bishops as late as like 350 or 360 AD. And so what I think happened is all of these questions had not really been asked or formalized. And there was sort of like what had been a spectrum became two opposing camps, and that they basically eventually went to war with each other over the course of the 4th century. And there was the main two camps ended up being what would become Trinitarians, although even in the beginning, they weren't really Trinitarian, but they were Jesus is equal to God in some sense, right? Jesus is not created. Jesus didn't come into being. He's always existed. He's of the same divinity as his Father, right? That's sort of one camp. And then the other camp was, well, no, God, the Father is actually a little bit more special, a little bit more divine than Jesus. And God created and caused Jesus, right? And so those were the two things. And so as weird as it is for us to imagine, 1700 years later, there basically being a civil war in the Roman Empire over this question, that's what there was. And it was a civil war. There were mobs in the streets of the large cities that would fight each other. They would burn down each other's churches. They would burn down each other's houses. They would kill each other. Hundreds or thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of people would die in these riots in the big cities of the Roman Empire, with one side saying there was a time when Jesus was not, and the other side saying, begotten before all ages, right? It sounds like an obscure theological question, but it was a flashpoint issue. And what I would compare it to is something like what we're seeing with our partisan politics in the US right now, where like, if I were to say, Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter, if I were to say one of those two things, every American would know whether I belong to the Republicans or to the Democrats, right? And to someone, thousands of years from now, they would be like, Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, what's the big deal? That's like you're saying the same thing. And so it can be hard to sometimes understand why certain questions take on the fervor that they do. But back then, this question of how Jesus related to God the Father precisely took on enormous importance. And so what happened is eventually what would become the Trinitarian side, after some back and forth and this side becoming emperor and then this side becoming emperor and, killing and burning each other, eventually the Trinitarians centralized power enough and basically used the Roman army to exterminate everyone who wouldn't agree with them. They literally killed all of the Arian bishops that wouldn't sign on to the new creed, or exiled them, or scared them off, or scared them underground, or whatever. And finally, with like the full force of the Roman military, established the Trinity as the law of the land. And so I think a result of that fight is that the Trinity became core to the identity of the Christianity that survived. It was core to the winning side. It would almost be like if the Republicans and Democrats stopped being able to even cooperate in democracy anymore and went to war with each other, and the Democrats win, and like for the next thousands of years, they make sure everyone agrees with like the core tenets of the Democratic Party in 2020. Right? Some people have those yard signs that say like, here we believe that Black Lives Matter and that science is real. And, right? They have a list of things that they believe on their yard sign. It would be like if they took that yard sign and made sure everyone agreed with every single bullet point for the next 1700 years. And so just core to the identity, it somehow even got passed on into most of Protestantism, not all of Protestantism, but most of Protestantism, that this is the one thing that defines our identity. And I think it's a result of the ideological civil war that happened in the 4th century, and we're still living with the after effects of it. And these people who kick us out of churches or remove us from leading Bible studies or won't let us take communion at their churches are in some way still enacting and still transmitting and still embodying the spirit of that ideological civil war. I think that's really the only answer that I can give that really makes sense.
I would call it a history of violence over a manufactured sacred cow, really. So what do you say, Sam, to people who look at you and say, wait, what do you mean Jesus is not God? What do you mean God is not three persons? What are some of your techniques, arguments for to start or maybe end that
Yeah.
conversation?
I think that,
Sorry, in other words, where do you go first?
where do I go first? Well, it depends a little bit on how well I know the person and where I think that they're coming from. But I will mainly just state, the first thing I do is just state a bunch of things that I know that they'll agree with, right? Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus died for our sins. Jesus ascended into heaven, or Jesus was resurrected. Jesus ascended into heaven. Jesus sits at the right hand of God, right? You just say a bunch of those sorts of things, and they're sort of like, I don't know if it's like, I think I'm supposed to disagree with you, but I also know that I have to agree with all of those things, right? And they're in this sort of weird in between space. And I don't try and emphasize the things that make us different, really. And then a thing that I'll do is that I'll often ask them, what do you mean by Jesus is God? And they often are strangely unable to give a good answer to that question, right? It's even people who have gone to seminary, right? You can ask them 2 or 3 or 4 questions and they will stop having answers pretty quickly. And I think that is something like the exercise that I like to do, because you can ask them, all right, how was Jesus God? And well, they'll say like, well, he existed from all eternity. It's like, okay, all right. So when Jesus said that I don't know the day or the hour of my return, no one knows except the Father alone. How does that work? And then they might say something about two natures. It's like, okay, great, all right. So Jesus has two natures. All right. So Jesus died on the cross, right? He really died. Can God die? Well, no, God can't die. Okay. So then how did Jesus die? Well, he must have died in his human nature. All right, and then you can get all of these things that Jesus did supposedly only in his human nature. Okay, great. So it's like, I believe in that Jesus that has the human nature that you're talking about. Where's this divine nature of Jesus? And it's like, well, when he does miracles. Okay, well, Jesus said that he could do miracles because God empowered him to do so. And the apostles also did miracles, and the prophets did miracles before him. Well, he did greater miracles. Okay, well, Jesus said, we'll do greater miracles than he did. And then you can do this sort of thing, and basically what I do is you squeeze out that they actually don't really know where Jesus's divine nature actually fits or works or where it is. It's like, so there's this human being who was born, who lived, and who died and did and said all of these things, and apparently that's all just his human nature. Where's his divine nature? What's this divine nature doing for you? What role does this play in your theology? And they like won't even know anymore. It's bizarre. And so that's often a train of thought that I try and do. It doesn't always go well. And oftentimes people, it's interesting, some people will be very curious and have a lot of questions for me. And I'm perfectly happy to answer every single last question, or if I can't answer the question, to say that I don't know. But will often happen more than the curious person will be the person who gets some whiff of what I think and then will immediately start trying to defend what they think, right? Well, what about this, right? And they're not asking it because they're curious. They're asking it to try and prove to themselves, really, that you're wrong. And that's a harder person to deal with because they're not actually interested in learning. They're just interested in protecting what they already think.
Those are very good points. First, agree on other Christian fundamentals. Jesus is the Son of God. He's my Messiah. He's my Lord. He's my Savior. They'll go, oh yes, amen, amen, and then work your way slowly to those very good questions. So, what do you mean God is three persons? How can that be? Because God is always speaking. It sounds like it's one person, not three persons when God speaks, and so on.
I love going to John 3:16, right? Because everyone knows that verse, and that has a very emotional, connection for a lot of Christians. And it's like, so who's God in that verse, right? And what's weird is, and this is what Dale Tuggy means by, a lot of Christians in the pews are just confused. every Christian who reads the Bible comes to know and understand that God is one person, right? You read the whole Bible, God's always talking about me, I, he, right? It's singular pronouns, it's just, everyone intuitively understands that when the Bible talks about God, it's one person. So then, when it talks about God and Jesus, they don't know what to do.
So what's your advice, Sam, for those other non-Trinitarians seeking fellowship around the world? So we're very familiar with individuals. Unfortunately, it's like we're all scattered around, So what's your advice for individuals or families like yourself seeking some kind of fellowship?
What's difficult is I still go to a Trinitarian church, although, the virus situation has made that difficult. And I have fellowship with my family, and I still have a very good relationship with my parents. I see them very often. So I sort of have a group of people in person that, know my full beliefs, but I go to a church that still doesn't know my full beliefs. And so that's difficult. Like I sometimes go back and forth between what is sort of the best hope for the future of biblical Unitarianism. Is it to just make our own churches and make our own institutions and have our own parallel thing? Or is it to try and pry open the already existing churches to be able to ask this question and to be able to have this be an acceptable opinion, right? And because I think that there's in American evangelicalism, there's been some opening of the mind recently on a couple questions, like on the topic of hell, right? It used to be completely anathema to not believe in eternal conscious torment. But nowadays, a lot of evangelicals will openly believe in annihilationism, and that's sort of like becoming an acceptable alternative and even a somewhat popular alternative. And it used to be the case that everyone had very strict definitions of what they thought needed to be the case about what you believed about the end times, right? And that was something that, you had to go to a church that you agreed with every single last detail on, how you imagine the end times to happen. But that is kind of slowly changing. And so what I really hope is like the same way that you have Rethinking Hell up here, the same way that I think that people are allowing a greater range of acceptable biblical alternatives on that doctrine, I really do hope and expect sometime that there will be a greater openness and tolerance on the topic of Christology. And I think that that would be a very good thing. So I sometimes struggle with which of those two things I think is better for us to concentrate our efforts on. But I suppose maybe we can walk and chew gum at the same time, and that we can work on both of those two things together.
Yeah, can you imagine, Sam, rethinking the Trinity by
Yeah.
prominent evangelicals like John Piper?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Chris Dade, if you're out there,
Yeah.
I still welcome you to change your mind on this subject. I've had a couple conversations with Chris Dade.
Right.
If he wanted to make a second website, Rethinking the Trinity, I think that would be just great.
What's your advice for anyone watching who is questioning or is a confused Trinitarian out there?
Just read the Bible and don't pretend that it's as hard to understand as it's not as hard to understand as you think. When it talks about Jesus and God, maybe that just is what it means, right? I know that there are some verses that are harder to interpret than others, but most of it really isn't that hard to understand. And so I think some part of it is don't overthink it too much. Other than that, there are some great resources. Obviously, I'm really excited that there's sort of a growing network of YouTube channels and podcasts. I really like what you do, Carlos, and I like Dale Tuggy's channel, Restitutio with Sean Finnegan, Biblical Unitarian podcast with Dustin Smith, and now there's that new Unitarian Christian Alliance podcast. So there's a whole host of online resources. Many of them are only a couple years old that I think people could really dig into. And if you like philosophy, you'll probably really like Dale Tuggy's. If you like biblical stuff more, you'll probably like Dustin Smith's. If you like the more personal side, Sean Finnegan's is a little bit better. But there's all sorts of good resources, and there's more and more every day. So I think that's very encouraging. And I think that slowly but surely, more and more people are finding each other and sort of coming out of the closet, so to speak. And I think eventually there will be too many people to handle that. A, it'll be easier to form new congregations, and B, mainstream churches will have to take this question more.